Hello, my name's Mark Saunders, and in this YouTube video presentation I'm going to be talking about research philosophies in business and management research. Other YouTube video presentations are available on my YouTube channel, Mark Saunders on Research Methods, and I'd like to thank my good friend and colleague Alexandra Bristow for her help in developing my thoughts on research philosophies. In this video presentation, we consider 5 major philosophical identities in business and management research. In effect, we're looking at the outer layer of the research onion. We're looking at positivism, critical realism, interpretivism, post-modernism and pragmatism, and we'll be looking at the epistemology, the ontology and the axiology of each of these, the in effect philosophical beliefs and assumptions behind them, the subject of another YouTube video presentation. And crucially, we'll be looking at the implications of these for your research philosophy for your own research. So in effect, we'll be thinking about your beliefs and assumptions and how these affect your research in relation to 5 major philosophies. And I must stress that there are other research philosophies that are used within business and management. For example, feminism. The 5 major philosophies in business and management research we are going to be looking at are as follows. We're going to look at the positivist. We can liken a positivist to a natural scientist working in a laboratory and trying to find things out, but trying not to influence the outcome and trying to be as value neutral as possible. We're also going to look at the critical realist. A critical realist can be likened to an archaeologist sifting through the layers to find meaning and understanding. Then we're going to be looking at the interpretivist. The interpretivist can be likened to an actor or an artist who looks at what's going on and interprets it and recognises there will be multiple interpretations, just like different artists draw or paint the same picture differently. We're going to be looking at the postmodernist, and a postmodernist can be likened to a political activist, looking for change, but also looking for things which aren't heard, the unspoken word and things like that. And finally, we'll be looking at the pragmatist. Pragmatists can be likened to an architect drawing plans where the main focus is using the most appropriate to get the best possible result. So those are the 5 philosophies we're going to be looking at, and within each of these we're going to be looking at the ontology, the epistemology and the axiology, and obviously the methods and going to be used as well. So let us start with positivists. Positivists can be seen as researchers like natural scientists. Their ontology, that's how they see the nature of reality, is that management or organisations are real, just like physical objects in a room are real, and management and organisations are uninfluenced by how we as researchers feel about them. And we're looking to understand something which is granular, fixed and structured. So we're actually researching something which is there and we can actually measure. That moves us nicely into epistemology, which is the nature of knowledge. And as a positivist, we would be looking to discover the truth and predict the future. And we'd be doing this through collecting data which would be observable, measurable, which suggests quantification, and would concern facts. Within this, we'd be looking for cause and effect, so we could predict, and we'd be predicting by building or creating laws, rules, and then from this to be able to generalise. So we'd look at a sample and say this is what we think is more likely to happen overall. In terms of axiology, the role of the values of the researcher, a positive believes that research is value 3. They believe that she or he is detached, neutral and independent, just like the scientist is in the picture. And they will, as a researcher, maintain an objective stance. So all this points to a positivist typically using quantitative methods, which will be highly structured. So, for example, perhaps using a questionnaire to collect the same data, using the same questions from a large number of people, or perhaps observing things quantitatively. Looking at large samples so you can do statistical analysis and measuring. So that's really the first of these 5 major philosophies. Positivists where researchers or the management researcher is a natural scientist. The next philosophy we're going to be looking at is critical realists. These are researchers as archaeologists, so looking through the layers for underlying causal mechanisms. In terms of the ontology, the nature of reality, for a critical realist, they see management and organisations as real, but not real in the same way as physical objects are real. So they're there, but you can't actually go and touch them. They see reality as structured and in a series of layers, just like an archaeologist does when they work their way down. And they're looking for underlying causal mechanisms to find out or determine what happens on the surface. So looking beneath to see the cause of the patterns we see on the surface. In terms of epistemology, the nature of knowledge that critical realists focus on, they focus on what they see as the truth, and they look at facts and stories and how they're situated within a broader context. And so they're looking for causal explanation, and because we collect data of what's happened, this is considered to be historical. The role of values, or the axiology of critical realists, is that they believe all research is value laden and that they bring their own values to the research, as indeed to the people who read their research papers and look at their results. They recognise there's bias, but their role is to try and minimise it and also point out to or explain where bias still exists. So they're trying to be detached and objective as possible, but recognising within this there will be some bias and then owning up to that bias. In terms of typical methods, a critical realist, this researcher as archaeologist, will be undertaking in-depth analysis of social and organisational structures. They'll be looking at things in a great deal of detail. And to do this, they use a range of methods and data. So they'll be using both numbers and words and pictures, so both quantitative and qualitative data, depending on the subject matter that they're analysing. The fourth of these research philosophies we're considering is interpretism, researchers as artists or actors. In terms of the nature of reality, interpretivists see organisations and management as processes, so managing and organising rather than management and organisation. They see processes as continually in flux, continually moving, and as complex and rich, so the need there becomes to collect more detailed data. These data are socially constructed by people and influenced by culture and language, and so of course there are multiple meanings for what one person may see. Somebody else may see it completely different, and this results in different interpretations and different realities. The nature of knowledge that interpreters focus on, their epistemology, is about making meaning, and they tend to focus on people's narratives, people's stories, people's in-depth actions, their perceptions and interpretations, and using these data they try and develop new understandings and new worldviews of what's going on, recognising that these are only one of a number of potential views. The role of values for interpretivists, their axiology, is that research is always value bound. As researchers, we are part of what is researched, and we will be subjective, and we can have empathy with whom we're researching. It is the researcher's interpretations, or our interpretations, that provide the key contribution to understanding. Not surprisingly, the typical methods used by interpretivists are qualitative. We tend to see here small samples of data and research done in depth with investigation and looking for detailed interpretation. So it's all about depth rather than breadth, and that's the idea of the small samples. The next research philosophy we're going to look at is post-modernism. This is where we see researchers like political activists. Postmodernists, in terms of considering the nature of reality, see reality as managing and organising rather than management and organisations. So they're very focused on the processes, the experiences and practices of what's going on. They see what's happening as complex and rich and, crucially, socially constructed, principally through power relationships. What they also see is that meanings and interpretations are quite often dominated by what is not said, silence, as much of what is said. So they see things differently in terms of focusing very much on power and meanings being dominated by what is not said as much as what is said. Their epistemology, the nature of knowledge, is very much about questioning dominating views. They show truth, in inverted commas, so what is considered truth is very much a product of ideology. They focus on things that aren't there, absences, silences, and look for where meanings have been repressed by others, and also where people's voices have been repressed in terms of the data they're considering. The role of values, the axiology of postmodernists, is very much value constituted. They see both the researcher and the researched being embedded in power relationships. For some of these research relationships, narratives are repressed and silenced at the expense of others, so keeping down some views and allowing some to become more dominant. They are reflexive, as we've talked about in other videos, and in terms of this, they're radically reflexive, looking for the alternative and trying to understand it. The typical methods used by a postmodernist are qualitative. So not numbers, but much more words and pictures. They take texts and realities and try to deconstruct them and reconstruct them, interpret them in different ways. They undertake in-depth investigations of silences, absences, and, as we've talked about earlier, they search for hidden voices and perspectives. The final research philosophy we're going to consider is pragmatism. Here we're using the metaphor of the researcher as an architect. In terms of their ontology, that's the nature of reality, pragmatists are concerned with managing and organising. They're looking at the flux or the changing processes, experiences and practices that we experience in organisations and see this is complex and rich. But for them, the crucial nature of reality is the practical consequences of ideas, so the practical consequences of what they're researching. In terms of the nature of knowledge, their epistemology is concerned very much with collecting data that will solve problems and inform future practice. And so they search for practical meaning of knowledge in specific contexts. And the data they collect is that enables them to understand better. Their theories are those that enable successful action within organisations and businesses. So their focus is very much on problems, practices and relevance and associated data to enable them to understand and solve problems. The role of their values is that their research is very much value driven, so their axiology is value driven. The research they undertake is sustained by their doubts, what won't work, what will work, and also their beliefs of what's important, and they're very much reflexive as researchers. Typically, the methods a pragmatist will choose will be a variety depending on the research problem or the research question they're trying to answer. Often they use mixed or multiple methods, so that means both quantitative and qualitative methods, and they quite often take action in research working with an organisation to effect change. But I stress here, the methods a pragmatist use could be anything. The crucial thing is the emphasis on practical solutions and outcomes. Let's now consider the implications of what we've been talking about on philosophy for your own research. First of all, I must stress that there are more than these 5 philosophies in business and management research. For example, there's also feminism. But let's look first at the questions which relate to your philosophical beliefs and assumptions. And just as a reminder, there is a YouTube video presentation on these as well. The first question is, what are your assumptions about the reality of what you are researching? That relates to your ontology, the nature of reality. The second question you need to think about is, what are your assumptions about legitimate and acceptable data for your research? This relates to epistemology, the nature of knowledge. And the final of these questions in relation to philosophical beliefs and assumptions relates to axiology. What do you think about the role of your values in research? Once you've considered these and the implications those have for your research philosophy, you need to be looking at a series of other questions. What will be your starting point? Will it be theory or data? Will you be deductive, starting from theory, or will you be inductive, starting from data? What research objects or phenomena will you focus on? What theories will you use? What data will you collect and how? Thinking ahead, how will you analyse it? How will you communicate your findings? This may well be in the assessment criteria. How personally involved will you become in your research? And you can see how this relates back to your research philosophy and your axiology as well. And what limits will your research have? And then you need to think about how do the answers to all these questions fit together coherently and relate to a specific philosophy, because they need to if your research is going to have methodological fit and be coherent. As always on my YouTube video presentations, I've put a series of readings on the penultimate slide, and here we have 3 separate readings. We have Easterby Smith et al.'s book Management and Business Research, Chapter 3, which gives useful insights into philosophies. Gill and Johnson's book Research Methods for Managers, Chapters 8 and 9 do the same thing. And finally, my own book with Phil Lewis and Adrian Thornhill, Chapter 4 is on research philosophies. And with this one, there is a link so you can actually download it free of charge.